we're at this dangerous place in technology where we know just enough to mess things up. We can edit and hack human DNA. What we don't know, Andre, is we don't know the implications of what we're doing because science and scientists have yet to fully understand what it means to be human. And one of the places where I think this is coming to light the quickest, and this is how science will learn. Science eventually will have, if science is to remain valid, science has to come to terms with the fact that there is something beyond the human body that is not being accounted for in the scientific models. I grew up in northern Missouri, and when I started school, I had the opportunity to see Albert Einstein's brain. When he died, they took his brain from his body and they preserved it in University of Kansas, and they thin sliced it to see what made his brain so different from everyone else, what set him apart from everyone else. And what they found was it looked pretty much like anyone else's brain, with one exception. His brain had way more folds. When you take all those folds and you stretch them out, it means he had more surface area to his brain. And that surface area is more neurons. Neurons, we now know, are essentially biological antennae. We don't store memories in our brains. We don't store memories of our loved ones in the neurons in our brain. The neurons are the antenna that tune to a very specific place, a vibratory space in the field that scientists now know connects all things. 2012, the scientists at CERN, the superconducting supercollider in Geneva, Switzerland, they announced, yes, there is a field that underlies all existence. Esoterically, we had known that and talked about, and everybody said, well, yeah, sure, there's a field, but the scientific community didn't acknowledge that until 2012. That wasn't that long ago. So there's a field. It is a subtle energy field, and information is stored in that field. Our neurons are the antenna that tune to very specific places in that field. DNA does the same thing. So, for example, when we want to learn something new, if you're trying to learn a foreign language, or I'm a musician, you're a musician, we're trying to learn a piece of music, and we're trying to mimic what somebody else does. And the first few times you do it, you go through the motions and it feels awkward, or you're speaking a foreign language and you're saying syllables that just sound weird. All of a sudden, you wake up one morning and, man, you're thinking in Spanish, you're thinking in French. Or all of a sudden, you wake up one morning and you're playing like Steve Vai, my hero, on the guitar. And people say, well, what happened in that time? Well, this is fascinating to me. If you watch the time-lapse photographs of neurons trying to connect, neurons are very social cells. They want to hook up, and they're looking for another neuron to hook up with. That doesn't happen instantly. It takes about 72 hours, about 3 days, for the dendrites to connect and find others. So here's what's actually happening. It is the act of you or me or anyone watching this to learn something new, to become something more, to better ourselves, to become something more in the next moment than we were in the last moment. That drive, that compulsion that we feel is the trigger. It's the command for the neurons to find other neurons to create the antenna that tunes to the place in the field that holds what we're asking ourselves to master. It's amazing to see this happen. And this is why a lot of young people today, new generations, their parents will say, man, my kids, they're having a hard time learning because things don't come quickly to them. They want to learn right now. And what I say to them is stay with it and allow the process. Give them 3 days. Ask them to stay with it for 3 days and see if it doesn't get better. And it does, whether you're trying to learn math, science, art, music, a language, whatever it is. So this is important. We need our biology to connect to the information in the field. Divinity is part of that information. Our intuition, our creativity, what some people call your higher self, when you're praying or when you're meditating. What you're actually doing is your physiology, what our ancestors called the temple. This is the temple, the vessel that holds the antenna. We are communicating with that part, that place in the field where many people have come before us and are also communicating with that place in the field. This is why when you begin to replace the natural biology with synthetics, there are no longer neurons. There's no longer DNA. And what that means is there's no longer antenna. So we still may function in this physical world. We have now been veiled. I don't want to say it's completely lost, but the access is veiled, more difficult to get to for our intuition, our conscience that knows what's right and wrong and good and bad, and the ability to communicate with other forms of life on subtle levels, other dimensionalities on subtle levels, the ability to meditate and elevate ourselves in those levels. All of that innovation, creativity, imagination, all of that begins to atrophy. If we don't use, and this is the danger, and the science is showing this, if we don't use those parts of ourselves now, so for example, computer chips are put into the brain, into the neocortex, and they begin to replace mirror neurons. And we'll talk about mirror neurons a little bit. It's a class of neuron. What the studies show really clearly is the new discoveries, is that the human brain continues to produce neurons until the last breath we take on this planet. We used to be told, when I was in college, I was told, you've got X number of neurons, and every time you drink a beer, you're going to lose a bunch. So that was the leverage, not to have a beer or whatever it was you were doing. Now we know that's not true. That we continue to produce them until the last breath of life. However, and this is the caveat, if a new neuron is produced and it is not engaged in a meaningful way, within about 14 days, it will atrophy and die because it feels like it's not needed. If we have AI virtual visors in our children that are entertaining them, everything is being done for them. So you got a 3-year-old sitting on the floor in the living room after breakfast with a visor for hours, watching extraordinary scenes and vivid colors and sounds they would never see in the natural world. But here's the thing, it's all being done for them. They're not engaging their imagination. They're not engaging their creativity. They're not engaging their problem-solving skills. All they're doing is being entertained. And what happens is the brain cells that are not engaged begin to atrophy. So now psychologists are publishing papers of young kids that are doing just this, and they have cognitive impairment because everything from motor skills to language to socialization, the visual cortex is thickening because that is the part of their brain that's being used. When we fail to engage our divinity in a meaningful way, those parts of us begin to atrophy in one generation. Next generation, your body says, we didn't use these much. Maybe we don't need this anymore. And it becomes an appendage of a skill that we used to have. This is how you lose a species. It's exactly how you lose a species because it's happening on the genetic level as well, with reproduction, with immune response, all of these kinds of things. So the point is that it's through our natural biology that we have access to our divinity or to our ability to transcend our perceived limitations. When our natural biology is replaced, then those skills either begin to atrophy or we lose access altogether to that field. We're still alive. We may no longer be human. If we define human through DNA and as Homo sapiens, we may become something very different. In 1990, I was hiking through a remote area in northwestern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon, in preparation to lead a group. I was doing a reconnaissance trip. And I was hiking on a remote trail, and there was a native man by himself who was hiking in the opposite direction. And he stopped, and we talked for a few moments. And he began to tell me a story. And the story is pertinent to this conversation. He said, a long time ago, the people of the earth remembered who they were, and they lived much closer to the earth, and they were much happier, of course. And he says something happened, and even the elders don't know what it was, but the people of the earth began to forget who they are. But they so long for the deep connection that they had between themselves and the forces of nature and the cosmos and the earth under their feet. They so long for that connection that they began to build in the world outside of them reminders of what that connection meant in the world inside of them. And he said, we live in that world today. We long for that connection. We miss ourselves, our true potential. And he said, we'll keep building stuff. We'll clutter our world with gadgets and machines and devices that continue to mimic and reflect back to us who we are, until one day we wake up and we say, oh my God, that's us. And then we will let the external technology go because we will have remembered to awaken our inner technology. The world becomes more sophisticated because we've awakened, yet it looks simpler because the external clutter goes away. And that man remains a friend today in one of the pueblos in northern New Mexico. But I think his story, and from his perspective, it gives us a deep insight maybe into why we are where we are in the world today. We are reaching this convergence point. We can all feel it. It's like a rubber band. It's just stretched so far. Something's going to give. And in probably many different ways, many things are going to give because it's unsustainable. But part of that is we're beginning to come back to ourselves and to understand who we are and what our potential really is. And that we are more than the machines that we have built, more than the AI, more than the computer chips. And so this is a decision now that we have to make as a society. Are we willing to give ourselves away to the efficiency and the speed of a computer chip at the expense of losing the power of human emotion, of losing our ability to have empathy and sympathy and compassion for another being? Are we willing to trade those things in for efficiency and speed? And that's a question we have to answer as a society.